The rain had started softly, drumming against the roof of Julia's quiet home, painting the night with a gentle rhythm that somehow matched the pulse of her thoughts. She sat by the living room window, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea, staring at the blurred streetlights outside. It was past 10, yet sleep felt impossible. The house, usually full of life during the day, now felt overwhelmingly empty. Echoing every little sound, the hum of the fridge, the faint tick of the clock, even the whisper of the rain. Julia had lived in this neighborhood for over 15 years. She knew the rhythm of the streets, the familiar shapes of trees in the yard, the way the wind stirred the curtains. And yet, no matter how familiar everything seemed, she felt an ache she could never quite name. It wasn't sadness exactly. It wasn't despair, it was longing. A quiet, persistent feeling that life had moved too fast, that she had somehow gotten lost in the middle of it. Her son, Ethan, had been a whirlwind of energy and laughter earlier that evening. He had been working on a school project, and Julia had helped him, as she often did. He was 14, now growing taller every week, his voice sometimes breaking in mid-sentence, his interests shifting from cartoons to music and sports. Watching him reminded her of fleeting moments, of times she could never reclaim. It made her feel both proud and painfully aware of the spaces in her own life that remained untouched, unspoken. Julia set her mug down and rubbed her eyes. The room was dimly lit, the soft golden glow of the lamp casting shadows across the walls. She sighed and pulled a blanket over her lap. She had always considered herself a practical woman, grounded. In reality, someone who faced life with logic and patience. Yet tonight, that practicality felt fragile. As though the weight of everything she hadn't said, everything she hadn't felt, was pressing quietly against her chest. A part of her wondered if this restlessness was simply loneliness. She had friends, of course, and a supportive community, but there was a type of solitude that no conversation could soothe. It was the kind of silence that whispered questions you weren't sure you were ready to answer. Am I truly living the life I imagined? Am I seeing the people I'm meant to see? Am I feeling the things I'm meant to feel? She took a deep breath, trying to push the thoughts away, when a sudden knock at the door startled her. The sound was soft, hesitant, but it made her heart jump nonetheless. Who could be visiting at this hour? Julia lived in a quiet neighborhood. Most of the time, the only visitors were the occasional neighbor or delivery person. But now, in the dark of night, standing alone in her living room, she felt an unexpected twinge of curiosity and a strange, inexplicable flutter of something she didn't fully recognize. She rose and moved cautiously toward the door. Her mind raced with possibilities, each one more improbable than the last. It's probably a wrong number. Maybe a neighbor needs help. Perhaps a car broke down. Still, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the lock. There was a pause, as if time had slowed just for this moment. When she peered through the peephole, she froze. Standing on the wet porch was Ryan, her son's best friend. He looked unsettled. His hair was damp from the rain, and his hands were shoved deep into his jacket pockets. His face was pale, eyes wide and searching, almost desperate. Julia didn't know what had brought him here, but the sight of him stirred something unexpected inside her, a mix of concern, protectiveness, and curiosity she hadn't anticipated. For a moment, she simply stared, unsure of what to do. Ryan had always been polite, cheerful, and a little shy. But there was an intensity in his gaze tonight that she couldn't ignore. Without thinking, she unlocked the door and opened it, just enough to step outside, letting the rain touch her cheeks, letting the cool night air fill her lungs. "Ryan," she asked softly. Her voice was calm, but her heart beat faster than it had in weeks. He looked at her and gave the tiniest nod, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Hi, Mrs. Caldwell," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know where else to go." Julia felt a pang in her chest. The words were simple, almost unremarkable, but the weight behind them was palpable. Something had happened to Ryan, something that had driven him to her door in the middle of the night. And in that moment, Julia realized that this quiet, ordinary evening, this familiar routine she clung to, was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. She stepped aside, letting him in, and gestured toward the living room. "Come in," she said gently. "Let's talk." As Ryan entered, dripping wet and hesitant, Julia couldn't help but feel that life had a funny way of introducing people into your world just when you needed them most. She had no idea what this night would bring, but deep down, she sensed that it would be a night she would never forget. And as the rain continued to tap against the windows, the house no longer felt empty. Something fragile, quiet, and unexpectedly profound had begun to stir within its wall. Ryan stepped into the living room, shaking the rain from his jacket. Julia offered him a towel, and he accepted it silently, draping it over his shoulders. The warmth of the house contrasted sharply with the chill outside, and for a moment, silence filled the space between them. It wasn't awkward. It felt like the pause before a story begins, the quiet hum of anticipation. Julia sank into the armchair, and Ryan took the seat across from her. She noticed the familiar nervous fidget of his hands. It's the way he avoided eye contact, and it struck her how much he had grown over the years. He wasn't the little boy she had first met years ago, clinging shyly to his mother's hand when he came to play at Ethan's birthday party. No, he was older now, a young man who carried a weight she couldn't yet name. And she realized with a quiet pang that she had watched him grow almost without noticing. "Do you want to talk about why you came?" Julia asked gently, breaking the silence. Ryan hesitated. I just needed somewhere to go," he admitted, his voice low and uncertain. "Somewhere that felt safe." Julia nodded, understanding more than he could know. She remembered when he was younger, when life had seemed simpler. Ryan had always been a quiet observer, the kind of friend who listened more than he spoke, who noticed details no one else did. Julia thought back to those afternoons when Ethan and Ryan played in the yard, when Ryan would sit quietly on the porch, sketching in a notebook or helping Ethan with puzzles and projects. She had always admired his gentle patience, the thoughtful way he approached everything, and there were the small moments that lingered in her memory, the ones that made her heart ache in retrospect. The time Ryan had stayed behind to help clean up after Ethan's birthday party, carrying the last few chairs and laughing quietly when Julia tried to insist he go home. The evenings when he would linger just a little too long, telling stories of school or music or books he loved. And she had found herself listening more closely than she intended. Nothing had been said, nothing inappropriate, but the feeling had been their quiet awareness, a connection that existed in small gestures, in shared smiles, in the comfort of being understood without words. Julia realized now how easy it had been to overlook. Life had moved fast, as it always did. Her focus on Ethan, her work, her routines, had left little room for noticing the subtler things, the delicate threads of connection that quietly wove themselves into her days. And yet here he was, Ryan, standing on her porch tonight, a living reminder of those small, fleeting moments. Ryan spoke again, breaking into her thoughts. I feel like things have changed, not just at school, but everywhere," he said, his gaze finally meeting hers for a brief instant before flicking away. There was honesty there, a raw vulnerability that Julia found disarming. "I know," she said softly. "Life has a way of moving us in directions we don't expect. We grow, people change. But sometimes it's the connections we've had all along that remind us who we are, or who we can be." He looked at her then, really looked, and for a moment, the room felt smaller, warmer, more intimate, not in a physical way, but in the quiet recognition of two souls who had shared years of intersecting lives. Julia saw in Ryan's eyes the same awareness she felt in her own heart, the weight of unspoken words, of feelings kept at bay by circumstance, by timing, by the invisible barriers life had set in place. They talked then, quietly, almost hesitantly, about the past. Ryan remembered how Julia had comforted him after his father's sudden move out of town. How she had made him laugh when he felt invisible at school. Julia recalled the time he had brought her a small bouquet of wildflowers from the yard, insisting that she should have something pretty on her kitchen table. Nothing had ever been demanded, nothing had been forced, was all in the quiet. Gentle gestures that made the heart notice without needing a reason. And yet, despite these small moments, despite the bond that had grown over the years, something had always kept them apart. It was timing, responsibilities, boundaries that couldn't be crossed. Julia was a mother, a mentor, a figure of stability in Ryan's life. He was young, discovering who he was and where he belonged. Their connection had always existed on the edge of something more, but never fully crossing into it, never needing to. Now, in the quiet of the living room, with the rain still tapping against the windows, that bond felt alive again, but different. It was heavier, charged with the weight of shared history and unspoken emotions, yet still safe, still tender. Julia felt it. Rain had eased into a gentle drizzle, leaving the air crisp and clean. Julia and Ryan sat across from each other, the quiet hum of the heater filling the small spaces between their words. Outside, the world seemed paused, as if waiting for something to happen. And Julia couldn't help noticing how different Ryan looked. Not older, more thoughtful, carrying an air of someone who had seen more than his years should have allowed. For a long moment, neither spoke. They simply watched each other, letting the silence stretch and settle. Julia's mind wandered back to all the tiny moments she had overlooked over the years. Ryan's shy smile at birthday parties, the way he had stayed behind to help Ethan when the games ended, the notes he would leave for her on random mornings. Small reminders that someone had cared in ways words couldn't capture. "Do you remember the summer of last year?" Ryan finally asked, his voice soft but steady. Julia tilted her head, curious. "The one when Ethan tried to build that treehouse." She replied with a faint smile. He nodded, a small laugh escaping him. "Yeah, I remember. You were there helping him, but you didn't notice me sneaking off with a hammer, thinking I could handle it alone. I fell off the ladder." He paused and then, almost shyly, added, "You didn't even get mad. You just helped me up and made me laugh." Julia's lips curved into a nostalgic smile. "You always were determined to prove yourself, even when you didn't need to." That memory, small as it was, sparked something in the room. It wasn't love in the typical sense, but a recognition of shared time, of mutual understanding. It reminded Julia of the invisible threads that had always connected them, the moments of care and tenderness that had gone unnoticed yet lingered quietly in the heart. Ryan shifted slightly, his hands wrapped around the warm mug she had given him. I don't usually do this," he said, hesitating. "But tonight I felt like I needed to come here. And seeing you, it just reminded me of everything I've missed. Not just about Ethan or the house or the quiet of your living room, but of this, us, talking like we used to." Julia's heart stirred. She could feel the honesty in his words, the vulnerability that had always made him different from anyone else. Something about the late-night stillness, the rain-scented air, and the quiet of her living room made this moment feel almost fated. It was as though life itself had conspired to bring them together again, if only for a fleeting night. "You're right," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It does feel like this was meant to happen. Not just the rain, or the timing, or even you knocking on my door, but this is stalking. It's like life wanted us to notice something we've always known, but never said aloud." Ryan's eyes met hers, and for a heartbeat, Julia felt the intensity of years compressed into a single gaze. It wasn't about romance in the conventional sense. It was deeper, quieter, and far more profound. It was the recognition of two lives intersecting in ways both ordinary and extraordinary. A shared history meeting the present in an unspoken understanding. "I guess I've always been afraid," Ryan admitted, his voice tinged with honesty and a hint of regret. "Afraid of messing things up or crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed. But tonight, I don't feel that fear. I just feel relief. that I can be here, that someone finally understands. Julia nodded, understanding all too well. Life often built walls where there should have been bridges. Timing, responsibilities, and circumstance had kept them apart for years. But here, in the stillness of a late night, fate had allowed those walls to fall even just a little. You know, she said thoughtfully, sometimes the universe gives us small reminders. Little nudges, coincidences that feel bigger than they are, just to show us what truly matters. Maybe this night is one of those moments. Ryan looked out the window at the glistening street, illuminated by the pale glow of the streetlights. Maybe it is, he said softly. Then he turned back to her, a faint, almost shy smile crossing his face. I never expected to feel this. Talking to you again. It's like everything that kept us apart, all the missed chances and moments, they don't feel quite so heavy tonight. Julia felt a wave of emotion she hadn't anticipated. It was bittersweet, tender, and quietly profound. The rain had washed the world clean. But it also seemed to have cleansed something inside her, the regrets. The what-ifs, the quiet longing that had lingered for years. She realized that connections like this weren't about timing or convention. They were about honesty, understanding, and shared history. And tonight, they were allowed to exist fully, if only for a short while, for a moment. The room was silent again, but it was a comforting silence, filled with the weight of what had been unspoken and the promise of what might come. They sat together, two people aware of the fragile, fleeting nature of life, yet fully present in the moment that fate had given them. And as the rain finally tapered off, leaving behind the soft scent of wet earth and fresh beginnings, Julia knew this night would stay with her forever. Not because of grand declarations or dramatic events, but because of the quiet, profound connection that had been reignited, proof that sometimes the present has a way of rewriting the past in the gentlest, most unexpected ways. The clock ticked quietly in the background, a steady reminder of time moving forward even as the world inside the living room seemed to pause. Julia leaned back in her chair, watching Ryan trace the rim of his mug with his finger. The dim light cast soft shadows across his face, revealing a mix of weariness and something she couldn't quite name, something deeper, more fragile. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Words had always been tricky for them, carefully measured and sometimes unspoken. Yet tonight the silence carried weight. It was as if the house itself held its breath, waiting for them to finally acknowledge what had lingered between them for years. I've thought about this night for a long time, Ryan said finally, his voice quiet and tentative. Not this night exactly, but nights like this. Moments I wished I could reach out, but didn't. Times I wanted to say something, but I didn't, I guess. I've always been afraid. Julia felt a pang in her chest. She understood that fear better than he knew. She had felt it too, countless times, holding back her own words, her own emotions, because the timing never seemed right, because life demanded patience, because she didn't want to disrupt the balance of the world around her. And yet there he was, standing at the edge of those unspoken truths, ready to share them. Afraid of what? She asked softly, leaning forward just a fraction, careful not to press, but wanting him to continue. Ryan's gaze dropped to the floor. Afraid of being too much or not enough. Afraid of ruining what we already had in case I felt something I shouldn't. Afraid of disappointing you or myself. And yet, here I am, knocking on your door because I couldn't stay away. Julia's chest tightened. The honesty, the vulnerability in his voice made her heart ache with recognition. She had seen that fear in his eyes as a child, in the moments when he hesitated to join games or speak up for himself. And now it had grown into something deeper, shaped by years of experiences, of growing up, of understanding life in ways only young adulthood could bring. Ryan, she said gently, her voice a whisper. Sometimes the right words are the ones we've been too afraid to say. Sometimes silence isn't protection, it's a wall. She paused, letting her own words sink in. And I think we've both been building walls for far too long. He looked up then, eyes wide, searching hers as if weighing her meaning. "Walls, I guess I've felt that too," he admitted. "I've felt it every time I wanted to say something, anything, but didn't. And I've seen it in you too. The way you hold back, the way you care so much but keep it quiet." Julia swallowed, memories rushing through her mind. She remembered the afternoons when Ryan lingered in the yard after Ethan had gone inside, when he would ask questions about her day, about books she loved, about life itself, with a curiosity that went beyond small talk. She remembered the times she had smiled quietly to herself, feeling a warmth she didn't fully understand at the time, yet had treasured nonetheless. Those small moments had been tiny sparks buried beneath years of routine until now. "It's strange, isn't it?" she said softly, more to herself than to him. "How life gives us people, moments, connections. And then we hesitate. We hold back. We tell ourselves it's safer this way. And yet the feeling never truly goes away." Ryan nodded slowly. "It's never gone for me," he said quietly. "Even when I tried to ignore it, even when I told myself I had other things to focus on, I've always remembered these moments. Remembered you. Remembered how it felt to be understood by you, even when I didn't say it." Julia felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. They weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of recognition, of longing, of the quiet ache of emotions left unspoken. "I felt that too," she admitted. "More than I realized. And maybe that's why tonight feels so different. Because tonight we're not holding back. Tonight we're allowing ourselves to feel, to speak, even if just a little." Ryan's lips curved into a small, hesitant smile. "I don't want to lose this," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I don't want to go back to pretending these feelings don't exist, even if we don't know what the future holds." Julia reached out, lightly touching his hand across the mug. The gesture was simple, yet it carried a world of unspoken words under. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind the quiet hum of a world washed clean. Streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, casting soft golden streaks through Julia's living room window. The late hour pressed softly against them, yet the room felt suspended in a moment that neither of them wanted to end. Ryan sat across from Julia, hands clasped around the warm mug she had handed him. He had been quiet for a long while, his eyes tracing the patterns of the carpet as if the answer to some question lived there. Julia had learned to recognize the signs, the hesitations, the shifting weight, the way his voice sometimes caught when he wanted to speak. She knew, even before he said anything, that the moment was approaching. "I need to say this," Ryan said finally, his voice low but steady. Julia leaned forward slightly, sensing the gravity in his tone. "I've been holding it in for a long time, and I can't anymore. I can't pretend it's just friendship, or that these feelings don't exist." Julia's heart tightened, a mixture of anticipation and gentle fear. She had suspected this night would bring honesty, but the words carried more weight than even she had imagined. She nodded slowly, encouraging him to continue, silently telling him that the space was safe. "I've cared about you. More than I should have," Ryan admitted, his gaze flicking up to meet hers for a fleeting moment before darting away again. "Not in a way that's reckless or inappropriate, but in a way that has stayed with me through everything. The summers, the birthdays, the small moments when you didn't even notice me. I've always remembered them, and I've always remembered you." Julia felt tears prick her eyes, not of sadness, but of recognition, of relief. She had carried the same quiet awareness, the same unspoken bond, the same longing that Ryan now voiced aloud. And for the first time, it felt as though the years of silence and hesitation were finally lifting, making room for something tender and real. "You've always been important to me, too," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't realize it fully at first, or maybe I didn't let myself. But it's true. I've noticed the little things, the kindness, the patience, the way you always knew when to be there. And I think I've always felt more than just friendship, too." Ryan looked up, surprised, as if her words had freed him from a weight he had been carrying for years. There was a soft vulnerability in his expression, the kind that made Julia's chest ache in the most delicate way. They both sat for a long moment, letting the confession hang between them, not needing more words because the honesty itself was enough. And yet Ryan continued, "I never said anything. I didn't want to overstep or make things complicated or risk losing what we already had. But tonight I realized that hiding it doesn't make it go away. And I couldn't let another day pass without you knowing how I feel." Julia reached across the small space between them, lightly placing her hand near his. The gesture was simple, but it carried a lifetime of acknowledgement, of shared understanding, of emotions long buried. "I'm glad you said it," she replied, "because I felt the same way. And maybe that's why this night feels so inevitable. Because sometimes you need a moment like this to finally let the truth out." Ryan let out a breath he had been holding for what felt like years. A smile spread across his face. Small, hesitant, and fragile, but real. "I thought I'd never have the courage," he admitted, his voice trembling slightly. "I thought I'd always be stuck with these feelings in silence." "You're not stuck anymore," Julia said softly. "We're here. We're speaking honestly. And sometimes that's all it takes to change everything." For the first time that evening, the weight in the room shifted. The tension, the hesitation, the unspoken longing, they all seemed to dissolve into a quiet relief. They were not rushing into anything. There were no dramatic gestures or grand declarations, only the honesty that had been denied for too long. And in that honesty, they found a connection that felt stronger than anything they had experienced before. Ryan leaned back, sense of calm settling over him. "It's strange," he said thoughtfully, "how life keeps people apart, sometimes for years, and yet, somehow everything still leads to the right moment, even if it takes a long time to get there." Julia nodded, feeling the truth of his words. "It's strange," she agreed. "But maybe that's what makes it worth it. The waiting, the hesitation. It makes the moment when you finally speak your truth all the more powerful." Outside, the street was quiet now, the night carrying a serene stillness. The rain-slicked pavement reflected the soft glow of the streetlights, as if the world itself had paused to honor their honesty. Inside, the warmth of the house and the glow of understanding between them created a bubble of intimacy, safe, tender, and profoundly moving. They both knew the road ahead would not always be easy. Life still had responsibilities, challenges, and routines to navigate. But for this night, and perhaps for many nights to come, they had each other. They had honesty. They had recognition. And in the quiet drama of truth finally spoken, they had hope. Julia smiled softly. "Maybe this is the start of something we've both been waiting for, even if we didn't know it." Ryan returned her smile, a genuine, relieved expression that spoke of years of longing finally given a voice. "I think it is," he said quietly. "And I'm glad it's tonight. Glad it's us." And in the warm, gentle glow of the living room, with the rain finally gone and the night embracing them in silence, both of them understood that this turning point was more than just a confession. It was the moment when unspoken truths became real, when hearts finally aligned, and when hope, delicate, tender, and fully alive, found its place between them. Morning arrived quietly, the soft light of dawn filtering through the curtains and painting the living room in gentle shades of gold. Julia stirred in her chair, stretching her arms and noticing that the house felt different, lighter, warmer, filled with a calm she hadn't experienced in a long time. The night had been long, emotional, and unexpected, but it had left behind a sense of clarity, a kind of quiet happiness that felt like the beginning of something enduring. Ryan was still there, sitting across from her, a mug of tea in his hands, staring out the window at the neighborhood streets still glistening from the rain. He turned toward her, offering a small smile that carried the weight of last night's honesty. "Good morning," he said softly, his voice steady yet tender. "Good morning," Julia replied, returning the smile. It was a simple exchange, but it held the intimacy of someone who had shared something profound without needing grand gestures. Words had done their work. Now, the presence of each other was enough. They sat together in silence for a few moments, simply enjoying the quiet, the residual warmth of shared vulnerability. Julia thought about how unusual it was to feel so completely understood by someone, especially someone who had been a constant part of her life in small, quiet ways. The bond they shared wasn't just about friendship, was about trust, honesty, and the courage to acknowledge what had been there all along. Finally, Ryan spoke. "I don't want to leave just yet," he said, his voice tinged with hesitation. "Not because I want to intrude, but I think I want to savor this. Savor the fact that we finally said everything we needed to say." Julia nodded. She understood completely. "We don't have to rush," she replied. "Some moments. They deserve to be lived slowly, remembered not just in words, but in how they feel." It was in that gentle understanding that they realized the true significance of their night together. It wasn't about dramatic revelations or sweeping gestures. It was about honesty, connection, and the comfort of being seen and valued. The night had revealed what they had both known, quietly and persistently for years, that their bond was rare, meaningful, and worth nurturing. Even within the ordinary rhythms of life, Ethan appeared in the doorway then, rubbing his eyes and yawning. "Mom?" Ryan stayed over. He asked sleepily, blinking at the bright morning light. Julia laughed softly, a sound full of warmth. "Yes, Ethan." Ryan stayed. "We had a long conversation." Ryan smiled at Ethan, ruffling his son's hair lightly. "Morning, buddy," he said. Ethan grinned and ran off to get breakfast, leaving Julia and Ryan alone once more. The house felt full again, but in a way that was gentle and reassuring. Life was continuing, but something had shifted within it as subtle. Meaningful change that promised new beginnings. Julia reflected on the past several hours. The fears, the hesitations, the unspoken truths, they had all been given a place, acknowledged, and accepted. There was no dramatic resolution because life rarely works that way. Instead, there was understanding, and from understanding came hope. And hope, she realized, was sometimes the most profound form of love. Ryan looked at her then, quiet determination in his eyes. "I want to be part of your life, Julia," he said simply. "Not just tonight, not just when it's easy, but fully. I want to be someone you can rely on, someone who values what we have and will do everything to preserve it." Julia felt her chest swell with emotion. She reached out, lightly touching his hand in a gesture that spoke volumes. "And you are," she said softly. "You already are." The day outside grew brighter, and Julia knew that life would continue as it always did, busy, unpredictable, filled with responsibilities and routines. But now there was something extra, a bond strengthened by honesty, a connection deepened by courage, and the gentle promise of shared moments that